So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Burkander from Research for Action, and I'm going to be sharing some findings about from our recent study looking into race-explicit funding strategies in higher education. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Shafika Little and McCary Atkinson, and note that this work was funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, but of course findings and opinions expressed through this research are ours and do not necessarily reflect the views of the foundation. I also want to note I have a little bit of a throat tickle, so hopefully I'm not going to have a coughing fit in the middle of this, but we'll see how this goes. So our study focused on two common policy approaches to increasing enrollment and completion among historically marginalized students: tuition discounting programs, often called promise programs, and outcomes-based funding, or OBF, also called performance funding. We know that these policies can both be designed with an explicit race equity lens and can both operate in the same state higher ed landscape. So we wanted to understand how these policies were experienced by those on the ground and how, if at all, they were driving funds to institutions that traditionally serve these populations, specifically MSIs and HBCUs. So we first conducted a national scan of state funding initiatives prioritizing Black, Latine, and/or Indigenous students and/or historically underfunded institutions. We identified 3 states that allowed us to compare funding strategies that showed some potential to improve equity in higher education outcomes and/or reallocate resources to underfunded institutions. We conducted 7 interviews with state policymakers and 13 interviews with institutional leaders in our study states. We prioritized the voices of folks at MSIs, but also identified a PWI in each study state to understand how, if at all, those institutions were shifting resources to promote access and outcomes for historically marginalized students. And for the purposes of this presentation, we focus on 2 of our study states, one with a race-neutral promise program and a race-explicit OBF, and one with a race-explicit promise and a race-explicit OBF. Oops, there we go. So we think about promise programs as a front-end, student-facing approach. These programs are marketed to students to induce their enrollment in post-secondary education at a reduced cost. Promise programs with an explicit race equity focus are typically designed to bolster enrollment of students meeting certain eligibility criteria, and institutions may or may not be incentivized to become more welcoming to these students in order to retain and complete them. OBF, on the other hand, is a back-end institution-facing approach. Institutional allocations are typically calculated and awarded at the end of an academic year based on institutional performance that year on whatever metrics are included in the formula. In theory, these formulas are designed to reward institutions for their efforts to recruit, enroll, retain, and graduate students from specific backgrounds, and that the presence of race equity metrics will motivate institutions to change or bolster these practices in order to earn more through the formula. So let's dig into the details of our study states, and we'll start with my former home state, the Garden State of New Jersey. So New Jersey has what we consider a race-neutral promise program. It's not aimed at any particular race group, it's aimed at low-income students. New Jersey's promise is comprised of 2 programs that work in tandem together, incentivizing students to do their first 2 years at a community college and their second 2 years at a public 4-year. This program covers tuition and fees for all 4 years for those with adjusted gross incomes of $65,000 or less, and caps tuition and fees as shown for 2 higher income bands. And while the CCOG permits part-time enrollment, the Garden State Guarantee, or GSG, requires full-time enrollment. But New Jersey has what we consider a race-explicit OBF formula because it includes additional weighting for enrollments and completions among underrepresented racial minority students, which in the context of New Jersey are Black, Latine, and Indigenous students. Institutions receive most of their funding through a base allocation, which is reportedly somewhat static and largely politically influenced. Then institutions receive additional operational aid based on their share of total enrollment and completions in the public 4-year sector, using an average of the last 3 fiscal years. For each degree awarded, institutions receive additional cumulative premiums. Institutions with larger shares of enrolled full and part-time undergraduate students, who are underrepresented racial minority students, also receive more weight for each student who graduates, thereby incentivizing institutions to not only help these students enroll, but complete. The additional higher education funding allocated through the formula has ranged from $80 million in fiscal year 22 to $150 million in fiscal year 24. As a result, the formula funding represented just 8% of the total institutional allotment in 22 and represented 17% of the fiscal year 24 allocation. and institutions compete for one pot of money in a zero-sum game. So in our conversations with institutional leaders at both MSIs and PWIs, we heard that they perceived that racial equity metrics in the formula were driving resources to under-resourced students and the institutions that serve them. MSIs appreciated the explicit inclusion of student populations that they serve, and PWIs expressed that they appreciated that the formula also included low-income students. However, we heard that the presence of the promise in the state has pushed four-year open access institutions to create their own tuition discounting programs to cover the first 2 years, rather than lose those students to community colleges or other 4 years offering similar programs. We heard that this placed some MSIs in the difficult position of having to compete and directing institutional resources toward discounting tuition, which has impacts on other services and capital maintenance. We also heard that because Promise is only covering tuition and fees, students are still getting about the same amount of financial aid as they might have before through Pell, which isn't covering the full cost of attendance. And this has led some residential campuses to advise students to commute. And while community colleges are located conveniently throughout the state to support commuting students, residential campuses are not necessarily located in commuting distance for students, so this creates a barrier. Promise programs, particularly those in the four-year sector that don't consider the four-year full cost of college, are not necessarily addressing the access and success barriers that students are facing, so are limited in their potential impact. Lastly, we heard that the funding formula is not accounting for historical and structural inequities between institutions. Having MSIs and HBCUs compete with PWIs in a zero-sum game ignores the fact that MSIs and HBCUs are significantly under-resourced and disadvantaged in that competition. We heard that PWIs were able to funnel additional funds leveraged through the formula into beefing up student supports, whereas MSIs needed those funds to address other budget shortfalls. In addition, we saw that tying OBF funds to enrollments among minoritized populations can make MSIs more vulnerable. Racially minoritized populations may be disproportionately impacted by external shocks like a global pandemic and the FAFSA debacle, which in turn suppress enrollments among those populations, which then disproportionately impact MSIs and HBCUs. I turn our attention now to our other study state, North Carolina. North Carolina has what we consider a race-explicit promise program, although we have that term in quotes because the legislation and program description do not explicitly mention race or race equity anywhere for political reasons. It's a really unique promise program in that it's focused on institutions rather than student populations. It reduces tuition and fees to $500 for in-state students and $2,500 for out-of-state students at the 4 participating institutions. The list of institutions is why we consider this a race-explicit promise program. 3 of the 4 participating institutions are MSIs, 2 are HBCUs, and 1 has a history of serving the indigenous population. The 4th serves a rural community. However, NC Promise is advertised exclusively as a college affordability program. An institutional leader noted that the political climate in North Carolina does not welcome race-based initiatives, saying that, quote, DEI is under attack. North Carolina has what we consider a race-explicit performance funding formula. 100% of institutional funding flows through the formula, and 75% of that funding is allocated according to 5 core metrics: the 4-year graduation rate, undergraduate degrees per 100 FTEs, first-time student debt at graduation, transfer student debt at graduation, and education and related expenses per degree. Most of these metrics are focused on efficiency and reducing debt. Each institution, though, must also select a metric aligned with the system's 5-year strategic plan that makes up the remaining 25% of their allocation, which is associated with their institutional goals for the 3-year cycle. One of these is a 4-year graduation rate for a, quote, targeted students of color subgroup, end quote, and institutions can select which subgroup they want to focus on. Each institution has a baseline performance identified for each metric, as well as a stretch goal, which is based on the performance of comparable institutions in the system and across the country using IPEDS data. Actual institutional performance on each of the 6 metrics is then compared to the stretch goal to determine the weighting for each metric, and then the composite weighted score is scaled against 3% to determine institutional allocation. So it's still a little too early to know how the new performance funding will impact the state's HBCUs and MSIs, but early findings from the first round of funding indicate that those institutions did not select the race equity metric as their optional strategic plan metric. They instead selected metrics associated with military-affiliated enrollment and adult learner enrollment, and one HBCU fell short of their stretch goal, so lost funding in this first round. 2 PWIs did opt for the racial equity metric and gained funding through the formula accordingly. Early findings from NC Promise indicate that enrollment and retention at participating MSIs has been helped by the program. There had been some concern that the program would negatively impact MSIs and HBCUs, but that doesn't appear to be the case so far. One participating HBCU had been on the brink of closure before the promise, but has seen their enrollment and financial stability increase. However, we heard that sustainability is now a concern. With additional bodies on campus, institutions are recognizing additional infrastructure and faculty needs. We also heard that because the NC Promise only covers tuition and mandatory fees, students are sometimes surprised to get a bill for additional fees and experience additional costs of college, including room and board and books that make attending a four-year residential institution challenging. We also heard that because NC Promise does not include residency as an eligibility criterion, the program is attracting a significant number of out-of-state students, and the state is paying significantly more per student through the program for these out-of-state students, which leaves us wondering how long the state legislature will continue to support the program as currently designed. Together, these states offer an interesting look at how OBF and Promise can interact together within a single state higher ed ecosystem, and how they together can support or disadvantage MSIs and HBCUs. We are eager to learn about the continued impact of the performance funding on MSIs in North Carolina, to see if institutions adjust their optional metrics in order to game the formula, or whether PWIs continue to benefit from the race equity metrics put in place. Unfortunately, our institutional interviews were focused on the NC Promise, and we didn't have an opportunity to interview institutional leaders about their selection of optional metrics, but that's something I'd love to learn about in a future study. We were reminded about how state promise programs can impact neighboring states, depending on how they're designed, which has interesting implications both internally for North Carolina and for its neighbor state HBCUs and MSIs. Another takeaway is the impact of promise programs on other state institutions and sectors. While the North Carolina community colleges are not complaining about any impact of NC Promise on their enrollments, we did hear that New Jersey's state promise program is driving the creation of institutional programs to compete for those students, which is disadvantaging MSIs the most, as their resources are already stretched thin. Lastly, one of the questions motivating the study was whether these policy interventions can address historical inequalities between PWIs and MSIs. And our research suggests that these policies on their own are insufficient, and that more needs to be done to balance the scales so that MSIs and HBCUs can compete on a level playing field with their PWI counterparts, which have benefited from years of systematic privilege. Oh, goodness. There's animation. I didn't realize. Sorry. That's what I've got to share with you today. I'm happy to share the final report once it's released if folks are interested in receiving that. And I'll be presenting this work at the SHIO Higher Ed Conference with representatives from 2 of our 3 study states. So I'd love to see folks there. And I'm happy to answer any questions.